Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. How's your reInvent going? Good? All right. So today I want to talk a little bit about composable commerce. My role at AWS is tech leader for retail and CPG industries. So I have a small team of people around the world that work with top retailers globally, and we hear a lot about this topic. A lot of retailers are getting guidance from analysts like Gartner, who I think might have coined this term composable commerce. It wasn't us. So we're putting together some thoughts and some architecture around how we think this should be done on AWS. So we would like to give more guidance and prescriptive architecture to customers in these industries. And I want to walk you through today how we're thinking about that, with the main outcome being business agility. So we'll go through the challenges that we've observed from customers. I'll talk through some solutions that we're working on that we hope will help customers. We'll talk a little bit about a specific API standard that we're using, that we actually use at AWS, so I'll give you a little bit of education on how our own service teams are using this technology. And then we'll talk a little bit about workflows, which is part of the main components in composability, is being able to compose different capabilities together in custom workflows. And then we'll do a recap, and I'll have some time for questions. So I want to start with this kind of mental model of how we think customers actually think about their technology stack, particularly in retail. You've got all these things that I would say in the enterprise services layer that are capabilities that every retailer needs, especially if you're selling online. You need cart management, you need inventory, you got orders, you got returns. And so those all ride on top of basically cloud infrastructure that's out there: compute, storage, managed services. I mean, we have retail-specific services on AWS around forecasting, personalization. You've got systems if you have stores that have point-of-sale systems. And all of those have to be basically abstracted or wrapped by a service layer. That's generally the pattern that we see everybody doing. And then they'll build their applications on top of that service layer. So they'll build their mobile, they'll build their e-commerce stack, all of those riding on top of those services. But generally, if you look at a retailer's architecture, they always look like, well, we have a microservice for cart, we have a microservice for orders, we have one for payments. And so what we're trying to do is distill and synthesize that sort of archetype or architecture that we keep seeing into a framework that we can bring to the industry to kind of help accelerate when a new customer wants to adopt this. And I'll get into exactly why we're doing that. So let's talk about the challenges that we see customers bringing to us. These are kind of the main three categories. You want to be able to provide holistic shopping experience or omni-channel shopping. You want to be able to, at the same time, choose the best-in-class capability providers. We work with a lot of customers who say, well, we use this big monolith ERP system for a lot of things, but we don't use it for loyalty, or we don't use it for forecasting. We only use it for inventory. And so what we're seeing is people just wanting to choose the best in class for particular capabilities. Now, at the same time, when they do a new contract with a big ERP system, they're facing a generational, or maybe not generational, but certainly a multi-year contract that is not something they take on lightly. So they want to make sure that they've got all of those capabilities, or at least a big portion, served by that provider. So that means there's a lot of complexity out there. What we want to do is help customers get to a state where they can build a converged, composable commerce system. And what we mean by the word converged is not just for the cloud and for your mobile apps and your e-commerce apps, but also for your stores. Because we absolutely recognize that retailers have the need to run services in the store, particularly around checkout. You just got to keep taking money. You can never stop taking money. And we've seen a whole bunch of sort of failure modes of when the network goes out, where people will get to the point where they're just taking credit cards, or they're resorting back to cash only, and it's a mess. We hear this all the time. So we're trying to also address this sort of offline, local store scenario as well. So here's some key components that we are thinking about, particularly for the retail CPG industries. One, we consult customers on this type of strategy. One is, one of the key ones is your orchestration service. So how are you building orchestration in a way that is done through sort of a business context, like in business capabilities? And I'll show you how we've been thinking about that and how we've done that through some of our own tooling. The next one is really getting best-in-class microservices. We hear that a lot from customers as something they want to do. I just talked about that, where they want to pick the best loyalty provider or the best forecasting provider. In order to do that, you need to know who they are. We have a whole retail competency partner network where we can make recommendations or introduce you to different companies that are in a particular area. And then finally, the mock architecture is it's an alliance of software vendors that are using microservices, API-driven, composable headless commerce. That's what mock stands for. And it's essentially a philosophy of how you serve software, but it's also becoming increasingly a specific architecture. And that's where we're actually trying to push the boundaries a little bit, is to actually get specific industry APIs, for example, around these capabilities. And when we do that, we also need to think really carefully about how can we accelerate software development teams so that they don't have to do so much heavy lifting. Everybody needs an SDK when they release a new service, so the mobile team can go build the integration with that service. And so how can we do this sort of SDK building as well as unit tests and mocks and all the things that go into software development? So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So to come back to the Instore thing, I want to talk about a little more concretely on what do I mean by that. This is like an example architecture where you can see there's a store over here, okay? So this is a store environment. And in there, you can see we have a thing called ECS Anywhere. That's Elastic Container Service Anywhere. And essentially what that is an agent you put on your existing compute. It registers with the cloud, and now it becomes essentially a mini data center that you can deploy containerized workloads to. So we think this is an interesting strategy for customers that have stores because they can now deploy services like payment services, loyalty services, product lookup, pricing services, everything that you need to have in your store, whether you're doing grocery or you're doing fashion, that are there in a durable way. And what I mean durable is like if the network goes out, you could still run these services. And then when the network comes back, it has a process to synchronize the data so that everything stays in sync. In addition to running at the edge, we also have modes you can do like local zone or wavelength. Wavelength is where you're actually running in a telco environment. So we've partnered with major telcos, and you can deploy your containerized workloads there. And then that would be a strategy where you're actually just using your iPhones or your tablets that your employees have in the store to talk to the telco environment in a very low latency way. So that's like, if you didn't want to run the compute in your store, you could do it there for low latency use cases. And then finally, you can of course run all of this in the region, the AWS region. But the point here is that you can have parity between your cloud services and your on-premise services. And we can of course go into more of this with detail with you if you'd like. Now, I want to talk a little bit about if you go down this route of defining services, building them into containers, deploying them, give you a little lesson on what we learned at AWS. This is just, you don't really need to read this, but this is like a list of the services that are on AWS, okay? We have over 200. We probably have 250 at this point. And what we found was we needed a way to build SDKs for all of these, because we have to support Python and Java and Go and .NET. And so the teams that deal with the API and the SDK, so they actually came up with a new model, a standard, and they called it Smithy. And this is what it is. It's something we've open sourced recently. And essentially, it's like a meta model. It's like a semantic model to define a service. Okay, and this is sort of the canonical weather example. And it would look familiar to you if you've ever used like OpenAI or OpenAPI, not OpenAI, OpenAPI, which is also like an API modeling standard. But this is one that we developed, we open sourced, and essentially it allows you to say, this is what a weather service looks like. It has operations like get current time or get the forecast for a given city. What we think we can use this technology for in retail is by saying, let's take the different capabilities that we see with customers over and over, like loyalty, order, checkout, payments, and build an opinionated contract for how that should look. And the only reason we're doing that is so that there's some standard and consistency to our consulting with customers. And then we'll build some providers underneath that or connectors that they can then pick out of like an open source repository. They can choose to use it, they can choose not to use it. A lot of this is actually what we're going to be building solutions around in our solution guidance. So we build, as solution architects, we build guidance for customers, and we want to bring more opinionated perspective that's sort of reusable. So this is why we're working with this framework called Smithy. So let me get a little bit into how we think about capability development. Essentially what you're looking at here is kind of a mental model of like when we consult with customers, we kind of try to break down who are the personas we're working with. Is it someone in marketing or advertising? What objectives do they care about? Is it return on ad spend? Or are they in engineering? And do they care about how fast they can deploy? And there's all these different KPIs or objectives you can imagine in an organization that people care about. But essentially, we bring those into use cases like, do we want to do personalized search? Or do we want to do dynamic product recommendations? And those would sort of come into a set of workflows that need to be developed. And a workflow is essentially where that orchestration comes in that I talked about earlier. Being able to orchestrate over your capabilities. And what we mean by that is a workflow has a bunch of actions that it orchestrates over. And I'll give some examples in a second, but that's where all of this sort of business process and consulting can be mapped out in a systematic way before we even talk about who's going to provide the underlying technology. That's like what we call a provider. And that's where we would map somebody that provides one of those capabilities to a service contract. So this is the process we're working on, and we hope to bring to retail customers in more of a standard framework for consulting. Okay, so I'll touch a little bit more on workflows at this point. They are business processes that orchestrate over capabilities. They're meant to basically describe a business process, and you should be able to do it in a way where you don't even really necessarily care who the underlying provider is, because you as a subject matter expert designing the workflow knows how it's supposed to be implemented. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's take the checkout workflow. And by the way, this is a simplified example, just so it fit on a screen, but we could say the objective here is to reduce shopping friction, right? And so the workflow in this use case is checkout. And checkout needs to orchestrate over the inventory capability, the fraud capability, and the payment capability. So those would be like different contracts that we would develop. And we would have these standard actions like check inventory, lock inventory, determine fraud risk, and process payment. So the designer of that workflow would be able to assemble up this process, and it would know what needs to happen without necessarily knowing or caring who is actually providing that. That's where the providers come in, where it could be a custom in-house provider. So if a retailer they roll their own services, they do a lot of bespoke development, they may just want to map these APIs into their own backend, and that's totally fine. That's one of our goals with this open source approach. Or there's actually providers out in the marketplace already, like Amazon Fraud Detector or Amazon Payments. So those are a couple first-party examples, but of course you can imagine third parties as well. So this is an example of a workflow for checkout. And then this is another example of a workflow for personalized search. And the objective here is increasing basket size, right? So we've heard from customers that if you can personalize search, you're going to get more things added to your basket, essentially. And so this is a high-level example of how you might do this through a workflow. You might actually hit your existing Elasticsearch or OpenSearch, your existing search service, and then you may have a step where you re-rank them based on the user context. So you're re-ranking those, and that could be wired in through something like Amazon Personalize. And then finally, you may enrich your search results with information from your product information management system. And so you can see all of these similarly would be defined as capabilities that you can write a workflow around, and then you wire them into your providers. And by the way, I should mention that the way that we're designing this and thinking about this framework is guided by customers that operate in multiple regions and segments around the world. So that they want to do this, but they want to do this in a way where personalized might be replaced in Brazil or with something else. Okay, they may have a workflow that uses more like the checkout workflow that does delivery estimation, and they may have a different way of doing that in Japan or a different way of doing that in Brazil. And so the whole idea with using the contract-based models is that you can develop your workflows in a way that can be used across geographies or segments, but the underlying providers can change per region or geography. So one last little thing on workflows. We have a workflow engine called Step Functions, and this is just an example of those two workflows, how this might be implemented using step functions to orchestrate over API gateway. So if all your services are released through API gateway as microservices, you can actually just write this orchestration through step functions. And in some of these cases, we're mixing in some event-driven stuff where we want to be able to asynchronously raise the process that happened, like did a payment fail or did it not fail? And this is interesting for customers that want to basically just use event-driven architecture to say, things are happening and I don't even know who's going to pay attention to this, but in the enterprise, somebody can subscribe to those events. Maybe it's your fraud team that wants to look at what's happening with payments, or maybe it's your shipping team that wants to look at the delivery estimates and audit that. A whole bunch of use cases, but that's step functions. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is, you heard probably, if you went to the keynote this morning, some talk about Bedrock. We think that Bedrock is going to be really interesting for this type of initiatives around not just building the contracts, the models, but also building the implementations, like the part where you wire up the model to a provider. And we've actually done some early experimentation where you can fine-tune a large language model, and it will actually start generating Smithy documents. You could say, I want to define a loyalty interface that accepts points and debits points, and it'll actually go out and do it because it's been trained on what those documents look like. And then the same thing with when that code generation happens and it turns it into like a programming interface for Java or for Python, you can also train a large language model on what does that code base look like, and then you can ask it to do an implementation or integration with Salesforce or with Oracle or with whoever your underlying provider is for that interface. And it actually knows. You'd be surprised by how much it knows. So that's the thing we're going to be leaning into a lot next year, is sort of helping customers with just generating integration code. So I've got about one more minute. I want to do a quick recap. We have a global team that we use in retail that gets a lot of feedback from customers globally. If you have stores and you want to increase your operational efficiency, that's something that we think a lot about. We'd love to talk more with you about that. And migration is another key enabler by this. If you can get to a point where you can define components or capabilities, and then you can start to think which ones do you want to move first. You can do it in a sort of ad hoc way. It doesn't have to be all or anything. And then accelerating customer-facing experiences. If you can offload a lot of that undifferentiated heavy lifting to services, let you focus on the customer layer, that's what we want to basically enable for you. So thank you, everyone.